Hello, everyone. This is another Freedom to Feel conversation, and my guest today is Dr. Nigel Brayer. He is a doctor of chiropractic, a primary health care, and a diplomate of acupuncture at Living Tree Center for Healing. He's also the author of Excuse Me, Ladies, by chance, do you pee in your pants? Question mark. How to resolve this embarrassing phenomenon that nobody wants to talk about naturally. So this is Dr. Nigel's book, and that's available on his website. So I'll have the link here. So this is my brief introduction to you, Nigel. But the first question that I love asking everyone is, how would you introduce yourself? Who are you in this very moment, and how did you become an actor?
Sure. Interesting question. Like most things, is it probably wasn't on purpose. It was kind of, I would say that I was led over the years. 28 years ago now, I was planning on being a primary care physician. My goal was to, you know, be a family practice doctor. But due to personal circumstances and a personal injury, when I was in my late teens, I had chronic pain in my knee, which brought me from being a really active, healthy young fellow to pretty much stopping my function altogether.
Mm,
So I went from being active to pretty much being sedentary for over 3 years. I'd seen many doctors from orthopedists to surgeons to oncologists. At one time, they thought I had cancer, bone cancer in my knee, and I had biopsy, and all that was negative, but nobody could figure out what was wrong with me.
right.
And of course, that was pretty daunting being so young,
Yeah.
because back then I had a deep belief that doctors knew everything and
Yeah.
they should be able to figure that out.
Yeah.
So, as the story goes, is I was about to start medical school in Canada at the University of British Columbia years ago,
Mm,
and I couldn't start just because of the pain. I couldn't walk across campus. I could barely drive. And then one of my family friends or something like that, I don't remember exactly who, they recommended that I see their doctor, and he was a chiropractor, and I knew nothing about chiropractors back then.
yeah.
I went in to see him, and he looked at me, which took just a few minutes, and he took an X-ray, and he looked at my pelvis, which are my hip bones, and he goes, "You have an inch difference between the two lengths of your leg." And I said, "Well, that doesn't make sense."
Right.
And so he asked me, he goes, "Well, have you ever injured your leg?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I had about 2 years, well, 3 years prior, I had broken my leg." Um,
Mm,
as I thought it was unrelated at that time, but I broke my leg, and little did I know then, but my one leg grew and my fractured leg was stunted because of the injury.
right.
And he said, "Well, this inch difference is causing a great deal of stress on the side of your knee. That's what's causing the bone to get big, which is why the oncologist thought it was a cancer growth." He goes, "Well, it's the stress of being out of balance." So
Mm,
he treated my spine a couple times, and he gave me a shim, like a rubber wedge to put on my short side. And
yeah.
3 years of pain vanished within a matter of 3 weeks.
Wow.
So little, obviously that made me question a lot of different things, from
Mm,
the crystal palaces where I'd went before, like all the big expensive hospitals, to this quiet little doctor's office in this town nobody knew about. He fixed my problem in a matter of minutes. And
mm,
so I guess that was kind of a major change in self at that time. So I decided I couldn't go on the path that I was going on, and I changed directions to get into more natural healthcare. So, and that's kind of where it began.
right. How wonderful. There's something about chiropractors. There's something about them. I don't know. They're very open to innovation, to exploring more the depth of it, what it is to be a human in the body. There's something about chiropractors. Do you? I know you have experienced this in a firsthand, as you just mentioned. Is that something that you see as from a broader view, like this big picture, that chiropractors are more open to self healing?
Well, I guess you got to take that into consideration, is chiropractors, and I can't speak for everybody, but just in
Right.
general understanding, is mainstream medicine has its value. So I'm not criticizing that. But you also have to remember where it's coming from and whose vested interest is in training and keeping their mindset focused on one thing. And
Right.
so,
Ah,
chiropractors in general, if you want to be a healthcare provider, but you don't want to go into the mainstream, I'll say dogma or ideology, you're
right.
going to step outside of the box. And by nature,
Right.
chiropractors usually look at things from outside of the box. And
Ah,
that box would be, I'll call it allopathic medicine, which is we have our specialties. We have urologists, we have oncologists, we have orthopedists, we have all these specialists, but we have very few people who look from what I call the 30,000-foot view.
mm,
Everybody's looking at the view from
yeah.
down below. And
Yes.
so,
Yeah.
in general, and this is kind of what inspired me to go into the specialty I work on, is when you start looking at the bigger picture, there's a lot of questions that start to percolate. And
Right.
when you ask the questions, interestingly enough, then answers start to come. But if you never step back, you can never really get to the questions.
Gosh, so true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. The way you explained that, yeah, that resonates with what my almost like a informed, intuitive thought, had come from. Um, I have a question. It's not out of the box. I guess I've asked a lot of times, but what is to be a healthy human being from your perspective, just in general?
So I'll just speak from my experience and observation and personally also because I'm in the same boat as every other human being as I have to find balance amongst all the things in our life.
Yeah.
So I break it down into the three stressors. I believe that our natural state is to be healthy, but what we introduce within that natural state is what takes us off the health path. So for myself and others, I break it into three things. The
Yeah.
three stressors are physical stress. That would be your frame, that would be your neurology, your spine, your nervous system, your muscles. The next would be nutritional, chemical, and hormonal stressors, which
Right.
obviously would be coming from our endocrine system, our diet, our exposure to electromagnetic radiation, all those different things. And then finally, mental stress, which
Right.
would be what we're creating between our mind. And I would say that's the biggest one.
Mm,
Um,
right.
but to break it down so it's manageable, because when we say things in kind of an esoteric pattern, it's kind of frustrating to people. It's like, well, what's the usable information? Well, if you think of the mind, the physical, and what we put into our body as the three things that we have control over, if we start changing one, we automatically influence the other.
Mm,
So,
mm,
from a chiropractor standpoint, that would usually be a biomechanical thing, like my muscles, my bones, my structure. That
right.
usually helps people feel better rather quickly.
Mm,
But that opens the door to ask the questions, well, what about my diet? What am I putting in? What
mm,
I put in is what I get out, but most people aren't aware of that either. And then the next question, you have to realize, well, what am I thinking about? Where's my headspace? What's my spiritual connection? All those different things, they all build up. And when we manage the stressors that we create, the body's natural capacity to be healthy just it flourishes. So
mm.
it's much like a plant, as if you give the plant what it needs,
Uh,
its natural state is to grow and be healthy. But when you
right.
suppress it from all of the few things it does need, then a myriad of different diseases will manifest.
So true. And the interesting thing is that we are not apart from nature, but we are nature itself as well. For some reason,
Agreed.
we think we are not, like a tree or like a flower, but that's exactly what we are, from my perspective. But of course, we have the mind. That's an interesting component of the human being. We are able to reflect on our own existence and kind of explore this realm of being here and what it's like. What is the meaning of being here? That's another question that I often ask, not in a philosophical way. It's more in a spiritual way, per se. Like, what is the purpose of being here? What is this all about, and what we are doing here? What we are trying to get, actually, is another question I love asking. Even if there's no answers to them, the questions themselves. There's something about the question that just stops me for a moment and puts me in this timeless space that's really beautiful to just reflect on, in this very moment, what is this all about? But this is my own journey. I love kind of exploring the depth of what is to be a human, and then what the soul, the spirit, and all those things. But going back to earth, to here now, where we are with your work. um, so Your book is about urinary incontinence. Talk to me about the intention. We talked briefly off record, but what was the main intention of writing your book?
So, like I said, it wasn't my burning desire to become, an expert on urinary incontinence in women. Like most things, is they're just kind of led. So, two things really happened. Is first, my wife with our last child, who's now 7, she started really reducing her activities, and just you know, less activity, less running, less jumping, less sports that we do as a family, all those different things.
Right.
And it took a long time before it surfaced, but it was really because she was suffering urinary incontinence. And it kind of saddens me that she wasn't able to share that with me right away, but that
Right.
just kind of enlightened me to the stigma that goes behind that type of condition.
Right.
Um, so that led me to kind of start this path of discovering or understanding, well, why is this happening post childbirth? And then I did a lot of review of my patient files of the past. And I realized about 7 out of 10 women of my patient base, and I have an intake questionnaire that asks a myriad of questions,
Yeah.
and 7 of 10 checked that little box. And I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it over those years, but as I reflected back, I noticed a lot of people have this, and it was never really addressed. And
Mm.
so, as I did more and more research, I started experimenting. Obviously, looking at the spine and the nervous system first, but my wife has been under that type of care for some time, so that wasn't an issue. But then I started experimenting and looking into the anatomy, and I realized that the understanding of our anatomy is really limited.
Right.
We think of the bladder as a balloon, and just for those who aren't aware, is we have two kidneys just by our middle part of our back, and both those come down through what are called the ureters to the bladder. The bladder is like a balloon, and then at the end of the balloon is like a straw. A male straw, it's called the urethra, is obviously longer than a female straw. But I was studying the urethra, and there's a little valve there. It's called the urinary sphincter. Now, men have two valves. They have one right where the straw meets the balloon. That's called the internal sphincter. And then they have one right near the end. It's called an external sphincter. But a lady only has one. And that sphincter is about, we'll say, about 2 centimeters, say a little under an inch long. And
Right.
so I was studying the innervation, which means the nerve input to that valve, and we always thought it was a consciously controlled valve. So I think of it this way: it's like your bicep in your arm. If I want to move my arm, I just flex it. I'm
Right.
consciously controlling that. But my heart, I'm not talking or I'm not beating my heart right now. That's unconsciously controlled.
Right.
So there's two types of nervous system. There's the autonomic, which we don't pay attention to, and then there's the voluntary, which we do. And then we also have another part of our nervous system. It's called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And so as I researched that valve, is we were under the impression that that valve was almost exclusively controlled by the voluntary part of the nervous system. And
Mm.
that's where most treatment sits right now. It's where Kegel exercises come into play.
Yeah.
It's where Botox injections come into play. These are all management treatment that they do for urinary incontinence.
Right.
Well, it wasn't until I started addressing the autonomic and the parasympathetic sympathetic balance during treatment that we started seeing amazing results with urinary incontinence. When we were just working on the physical components, we had small successes,
Mm.
but 30% in my opinion is not good enough. And
Right.
so when we started addressing the physical, that means the voluntary, and we started addressing balancing the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, we had just enormous outcomes with treatment. So as I did this for must be hundreds of people over the last several years, I thought to myself, okay, well, how can I do this so that people don't have to come into my office?
Mm.
Obviously, there's one of me and there's a lot of people. How do
Yeah.
I help get it to a larger group? And obviously, it's not by just working harder and faster, right?
Mm. Yeah.
So, what I did then is I started experimenting with my protocol. Instead of me using acupuncture needles, instead of me teaching people how to do things, I instructed them, and then based upon the severity, I had them do these things at home.
Right.
And I found that the outcome was almost as good as when they came in and saw me. So I thought to myself, well, let's put this in a format that everybody can get to. Um, then they don't have to spend a lot of money seeing doctors,
Mm.
and then they can get the results that I was seeing in the office. So that was kind of the indirect pathway over the last several years.
Yes, it's truly beautiful. Thank you so much, Nigel.
My pleasure.
Wow. Yes. Wow. So this is fascinating to kind of realize that it is by asking questions, by investigating deeper, that we get to know what's already there, right? In a way, it's never hidden, really. It takes curiosity, that intention, that it's almost like that desire to make a difference. That's what I see in you. It's really beautiful, coming from your own experience with your wife too, which is beautiful to see. And thank you for sharing that, because that relates to a lot of women out there. And it's so true, the fact that we we are ashamed of things that I mentioned off record with you, that are natural. That really surprised me and fascinates me at the same time. Why do we react or respond unnaturally to something that's natural?
Sure.
Do you wonder why that happens at so many levels?
Yeah, I've had that question asked several times, and as I pondered it, I think back to just when we're young, what was our very first
Yeah,
milestone?
right.
And I think our very first milestone was being potty trained. So you think about how much of our
Yeah,
unconscious self-worth was based upon that when we were young. And again, these are all subconscious patterns. Most of our fears and insecurities come long before we could reason it out and use
true.
logic.
Yeah,
So I think about how, and I've experienced this with many of my patients, is I think their feeling of value dramatically drops
yeah.
because if I can't do this, I must not be that. And just think
Mm,
about that,
mm,
reflecting back to a young child, if you've been exposed to children, is
yeah,
there's a big to do about that. And
yes,
everything branches off of that. It's like,
right.
oh, he's potty trained or she's potty trained, or look at them. And you see how that builds. And over a lifetime, that becomes a pretty big deal. So I
Mm,
think it has a huge value of self
mm,
worth. Now, you know, whether we should or shouldn't, it's kind of irrelevant. That's the fact is that there's a lot of attachment to that milestone.
right. And that's so true. And
Yeah.
that's the department of psychology, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people, they look for therapy in order to correct that way of thinking, belief systems. Yeah. So the treatment that you have found, that sounds incredibly, I mean, wonderful to me, because we want to, I mean, from my perspective, I would do that immediately. I would try something that feels very natural, and then I would kind of avoid surgeries and medications and all those things. That would be definitely my approach. So, talk to me about the Iron Clad Bladder System program. Is that related to the treatment, one and the same, or?
Yeah, they're one and the same. So the ironclad bladder is essentially the protocol that I tried and true in the office that we've made available to people for at home.
Right.
And so, and that incorporates, again, is it incorporates the retraining of some of the bladder meridian protocols. It works on releasing the tension that often occurs in the perineum, which is the lower part of the pelvis, from childbirth to trauma to
Yeah.
ongoing stress.
Yeah.
And it also as using what's called biofeedback techniques to help people to start to become more present, which
Yeah.
I'm sure you're quite
Mhm.
aware of, is
Yeah.
most of us aren't present. We're either in the past or in the future,
Yeah.
but it's a really key to bring
Mm.
us back to the now,
Yeah.
which of course is where
Mm.
things can be changed.
Yes. What can I say about that? That's my love affair with life, being in the moment and the practice of being here.
Sure.
Yes. That kind of surprised me that stress relates to urinary incontinence. I didn't know that. I mean, of course, we know that stress affects everything, right, in a way. But I didn't know the direct relationship between the two. Um, Things. So another question. I mean, I have a lot of questions, way too many questions. I guess I'm 48 now, so I'm wondering, ah, should I already start thinking about? I don't want to overthink or think ahead of time, but what would you advise somebody like me?
So my biggest advice would be is, and you're already on this path, of course, but the self-awareness is key number one. And then just ask the questions about stress, and
Mm,
I go back to mindfulness.
Yeah.
is our body is in a constant state of responding, even when we don't think it is. And
Right.
so urinary incontinence is an outcome to a bunch of factors that have built up.
Yeah.
So my ironclad bladder system isn't magical, it's just undoing this accumulation.
Mm,
So a person who doesn't have it, the biggest first step is starting to look into what is my stress level? And again, telling somebody who's under a lot of stress, that usually doesn't make a lot of sense because they're like, oh, I'm not stressed, I'm fine.
yeah.
But I would say the first step would be is looking into the mindfulness practice of, I'm a big advocate for meditation.
Yeah.
I would say the first step would be starting to take daily time
Yeah.
to just sit and let go and breathe.
Mm,
Now, for others, that could be a daunting task. So I encourage them just 10 minutes or five, whatever they can do, but schedule it, is to start doing a daily breathing practice. You can call it what you like. If a person's a religious, say they're connecting with God. If somebody's not religious, say they're connecting with the universe. It doesn't matter. Just start connecting to quietness. And
mm,
then without even the intention of anything, just
right.
the intention of breathing, because things start to filter in,
Yeah.
and in time you'll start to notice things. And I can't tell patients what they're going to notice because I don't have that power, but
Right.
the noticing is what's important. Because as we start doing these things on a regular basis, I liken it to, anything we want to change is, if we want to start making small little changes over time, the momentum builds.
Right.
So mindfulness is the same way, but why we're doing this is we're looking at our body. So
Mm,
urinary incontinence is an outcome of several different factors that have built up. Well, all those factors relate to how's our body managing all of the barrage of things that we expose it to mentally, physically, and otherwise. And I'd say the quickest and easiest is to start with the mind because
yeah.
it has this overpowering effect on the body. And that would be a few minutes a day doing some mindfulness breathing and just be curious and see what happens.
Yeah.
Don't try to stop thinking. That's something else people have challenge with. The
Right.
goal isn't to stop thinking. The goal is to just observe
Mm,
and be okay. And over time, the thinking will just cease on its own without you trying. And
mm,
that's going to affect your heart rate. That's going to affect, most importantly, the autonomic nervous system
right.
and the sympathetic parasympathetic, which is so, so important.
So true. Gosh, I love that as a suggestion. Yes, that's something that I practice every day, throughout the day. But would that prevent the symptoms, like from having this, or regardless, it will show up? It will
Sure.
be something that I'll have to deal with.
So I wouldn't say have to deal with it. This condition, like I said, has many factors. So there's the mind, autonomic, parasympathetic, those nervous system components. There's also hormonally based factors,
Yeah. Yeah.
the changes in estrogen and progesterone and how it affects tissue.
Right.
There's the components related to digestion and whether there's sensitivities. So there's a myriad of different things. But I would say is, if you start breathing regularly, and then second of all, start writing down everything that
Mm,
crosses your lips. So I encourage people, the next step is
yeah.
start noting everything that goes in your mouth, not
Uh,
even with an effort to change it,
yeah.
just an effort of observation.
Mm,
So a good example is, I always share with patients, I said, imagine, your best friend comes to you and says, Nigel, I'm broke. What's the very first thing you're going to ask them? Is you're going to say, well, what are you spending your money on? And
mm,
if they said, well, I don't know, you're going to ask them, you're going
mm,
to say, well, you should probably
mm,
just pay attention. And the
mm.
same goes with food, is if we start paying attention,
Wow.
it's kind of like your friend who's broke. You'll start realizing that $9 cup of coffee every day probably isn't helping your cause any, without even feeling bad about it. You just start buying the dollar cup instead of the $9 cup, right? So it's the
Yeah.
same with food. As you start realizing, when you pay attention, what's going into your body. And
Wow.
remember, toxins are burdens. So you can
Yeah.
imagine a smoker who's smoking, is they're putting in a toxic burden regularly, and their body has to deal with that burden. Therefore, it has much less resources to deal with other challenges of life.
Mm,
So you remove a burden, the
wow.
body has more functionality for other things. And of
Yeah.
course, it affects the bladder, it affects the heart, it affects the digestion. So I would say the breathing, and the next is paying attention to what you consume.
Wow. That's a big one. That's so true. I noticed that eating a vegetarian diet has been very helpful in every way for me. Of course, my husband, he eats meat, and then sometimes I eat it with him too. But it's funny how I feel like the body feels so much better. It operates so much better at many levels when I don't eat animal. Um, Produce animal anything byproducts. So, is that something that you also recommend to become a vegetarian or vegan?
Sure, that's a touchy subject. Not so much because a lot of people attach things to being vegetarian or not. I look at it from the factual standpoint. For example, there's a book that's been written, it's several years old, but I found it to be very useful. It's called Eat Right for Your Blood Type.
Yeah,
And it just correlates that different diets are affect people differently.
right.
Um, and just case in point is my wife's blood type, I believe, is O. She feels amazing when she eats
Mm.
vegetarian.
Yeah.
I'm a B positive blood type, and if I eat vegetarian, I feel so weak after about two
Mm.
weeks that I
Right.
can hardly function.
Right.
So
Yeah.
and I'm not saying that book's the be all end all, but I do know that our body needs protein and it needs fat.
Yeah.
And there's certain constitutional things that affect people. Um,
Right.
Most of the unhealthiest people that I've ever worked with in practice were vegetarians, not because vegetarianism is bad, but because their awareness of nutrition was very lacking.
Mm.
So they had other reasons for being vegetarian and they weren't really health related. But
Right.
if we don't get fat and if we don't get protein, our body can't heal, our neurotransmitters, our hormones can't be produced. So
True.
it's very possible to be a healthy vegetarian, but most are not because the breadth of knowledge that they need to be healthy isn't there. So I usually, like myself, as I'm not vegetarian, though I've been vegetarian in the past for a while.
Yeah.
I'm more of what's called paleo, which is vegetables and protein,
Yeah.
and very little grains of any sort.
Yeah.
And again, that's not right for everybody, but my goal is to help the large breadth of people. And most people, it's difficult for them to get what they need if they're missing out a big portion of healthy fats and proteins, which
That's
is
true.
easiest to get through an animal source, but not impossible to get veggie only.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I
Yeah.
don't know if
Thank you for
that's
saying that, for clarifying that. And it's very clear to me. Yes, all bodies are different. We cannot try to apply certain methods, diets, or whatever it is, and that everybody else is doing just because they are doing. So I wanted to be like them. Yes, and I tried that before too, becoming only a vegetarian. It didn't work. So now I eat. I love fish though. I like salmon a lot. That's
yeah,
one of the things that I kind of would go mostly vegetables, yeah, but no grains, and then salmon. I just like
yeah.
that. There's something about salmon. So let me see. Yeah, I love there's a quote. It's not even a quote. Is that, yeah, in your book? I think you say the body's capacity to heal is limited only by the beliefs that we hold. So this is really powerful and empowering to kind of contemplate, isn't it? This idea that the body can, it's a healing machine in a way. It can just do the work if we allow it to do it. It's limited only by our belief systems. I mean, it's almost like all questions vanish, just by contemplating this sentence that you wrote. It's just perfect and it's so true. How did you, I mean, if I have a question, how did you come across this in a very real way for you? When was that moment that you realized that this was true?
Well, I guess mostly it goes back to questions, right? We look at a myriad of different people, and I've had the blessing of meeting
Mm,
thousands of people, maybe even hundreds, that I'm not quite sure, over
yeah.
the last many years. And the question becomes is why are some people healthy and why are some people not? And I go back to the triangle that we talked about earlier. We have physical stress, nutritional chemical stress, and mental and emotional stress.
Yeah.
And so let's say we see this person who, from most people's view, look very healthy. They're physically fit and they have energy and their diet's healthy, but yet they have cancer and then they die.
Right.
Or let's say this other person seems to have none of that and they're living till they're in their 90s.
Right.
So
Right.
I guess through just
Uh-huh. Yeah.
questions and personal interest and kind of spiritual um,
Mm.
cultivation, you start looking and seeing, well, what makes the differences? Why this person and not this person? And I
Right.
think what the key
Mm.
is it goes deeper. It goes into the belief system, and
Mm.
so and beliefs are deep. Really good things can come out of belief systems, and really not so good can come out of beliefs. But we
Right.
all have them. Some of them we chose, some of them we didn't. But I do know that when people start changing the way they think and their mode of operation, then everything changes. And
Mm.
so
Yeah.
I go back, and I don't want to get terribly esoteric on you here, but we go back to like the spiritual. I'm a big follower of Jesus, not so much the religious Jesus, but the Jesus of um,
Yeah.
the Messiah.
Yeah.
So, and he says in there, he goes, you have all these powers that I have. You don't necessarily know it. And I'm just paraphrasing, obviously.
Yeah.
But what was the difference? The difference is that insight into the grandeur that none of us could fathom,
Yeah.
that he fathomed. And
Mm.
then once your awareness has opened up to the universe, then you're open to infusion from the universe. So
Mm.
then the question becomes, well, why aren't we all being infused? And
Yeah.
the answer is because of our barriers. And those barriers are ego barriers, our belief barriers. So we can only accept as much as we're willing to accept,
Mm.
and most of us have a very limited ability to accept much. Therefore, we don't
Right.
get much. And I don't mean get or not get because of, we don't
Mm.
deserve it. None of that. I'm not speaking in that term. I'm speaking of our ability to be open to what's possible is limited because our beliefs of what's possible are limited.
Mm.
So, as
Yeah.
we work on expanding our understanding, and that's why I'm a big advocate for meditation,
Yeah.
because when you quiet and open your mind from the chatter, then
Mm.
you're allowing in the universe to start to penetrate your human consciousness and start opening to you to like horizons you haven't ever contemplated before. Does
Mm.
that make sense?
Gosh, yeah. What's not to love about that? Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I know this, and we're talking about science a lot, and you're coming from science, and spirituality is not a science, although some people try to do that, but because we can't really prove, right, that God exists. We only know, we can know it, but we cannot really. Some people say they have evidence for it, but I think it's very personal, isn't it, Nigel? I love the way you said that. And it goes back to me when it comes to coming from spirituality to practicality, is all about nature being natural, simple, and then of course it's enveloped by love, and then just loving everything. Being, it's almost like being in love with life, and that's what we are, aren't we? We don't have a life, we are life. And it seems like we have forgotten this, the sacredness of humans, of the natural world. That's when, to me, I can almost like see the face of God when I see people honoring the sacredness of the human being, of what is to be a human. We are sacred, and everything in here in this world, it's sacred. But for some strange reason, we have forgotten, we have distanced ourselves from it. And it might be from that, that gap that creates all the imbalances, the unhealthiness of every level, the mind, the heart, emotions, and the physical body. It really feels that way because I've been on the path of spirituality for a while now, with practice of meditation, contemplation, and you name it, from different backgrounds. But first, yeah, from Catholic. My parents were Catholic, so I started there. But I noticed that the deeper I go into it, the healthier I become, the body becomes. So that's kind of interesting to see the relationship. As you said, it's almost like in the universe. Now you become this sort of this vessel, to accept something that it's not visible and it's not physical, and then it becomes physical through the way we interact, right? The way we navigate this reality, through what we do, the way even we use words. Like, I love the word sacredness. There's something about that word that's just yeah, it's just beautiful. So thank you for bringing this to this conversation, the sacredness of what we are. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And God, I could talk about this forever. That's really one of the. I mean, this platform was created. Emotional health. That was really where the idea was to become healthy in that sense. But then spirituality took over, in a sense of honoring the sacred. So going back to your book, do you want to make a comment, Nigel, about that? All that I just said.
Yeah, I think in lieu of what you had just said, Valeria, is
Yeah.
it's really about resonance and vibration. So I like to think about our mind and our connection to spirit as a generator, and
Mm,
so we're all emitting at any moment
yeah.
a frequency. So
Yes.
the analogy I like to think about is your cell phone's busily emitting all the time,
Mm,
um, good and bad, obviously. That's a different
yeah.
subject.
Yeah.
But our body is emitting all the time, also. And
Yeah.
so the sum of our emissions are the life we experience. And
Yes.
so if we're emitting healthy things through our thoughts, especially,
Right.
then of course our cells are being influenced by that. So
Right.
my observation is our body's a blossom of our mind. That's a quote
Mm,
by Imelda Shanklin from
yeah.
1940 or so.
Mm,
But I'm a true believer in that is as our resonation of our inner thoughts change from self grandification, how do I take care of myself, how do I take from you so you don't take from me, those type of lower energy vibrations,
right.
they're attracting other things to us.
Right.
If our vibrations are on a different level of how do I help, how do I purify myself, how do I become closer to the universe, then
Yes.
obviously our resonations are different, and that's going to show up in our bodies and our life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautifully said. God, I love that quote. Yes, right. The blossoming of the body. It's a reflection of the mind. And then would you say that the thoughts that those beautiful thoughts that feel to me like when I listen to some people speak about, the relationship with the sacred, with the divine, it feels like a song to me. So would you say that that's coming, those thoughts are being influenced by a reflection of the divine itself? Is that your understanding too?
Yeah. So if you think of thoughts come first, words come second, and deeds come next.
Right.
So a purified thought sends out a purified word, which
Yeah.
would obviously resonate with people who are receptive to that.
Right.
Obviously, some people would think our
Right.
conversation is, wacky,
Yeah.
right? So not in a judgment way, but
Yes.
that's not going to resonate with certain people,
Right.
just like what they say might not resonate with us.
Right.
So I
Right.
think it's everything's about entrainment, which is, and
Mm,
that's in my opinion where science and spirituality truly connect is through the unseen, through the entrainment of vibration.
mm,
Um,
mm,
because science hasn't necessarily found the right tools to measure it yet, it's only a matter of time. Because everyone thinks that they have to be mutually exclusive, but they're, in my opinion, they're the same. It's just in our arrogance, we just haven't caught up to the spirituality yet.
yes, I love that. Yeah, thank you for saying that too. Right. But the interesting thing that we do have a lot of research behind states of mind, of heart, like love, like
Mhm.
kindness, gratitude. But you're right. They have not made that connection. They have not said that gratitude, love are coming from a spiritual, divine space. That has not been said by the science yet. Has not been an evidence, but it's very clear to me.
Yeah,
So,
me also.
what's not to love about that? And yes, you're right. Some people might not resonate, and that's okay, because and the funny thing is we're having a conversation about science and spirituality at the same time, right? How the body, it's something that if we don't learn to ask questions, as you said, go deeper with the questions of the nature of the body. See, it goes back to the nature of something. So the body, and then the mind, the nature of mind, and then the nature of life itself. So that's what at some point we have to start asking all these questions. I know that some people still at a different level kind of starts with the questions for the body because for survival reasons, and then they're moving up to the emotions, and then one day I think we are actually walking on this path right now in this direction. I really feel that way for some reason. Something has happened, but I don't know, it might be just that I'm late for everything. I'm not good with time, so that might be that I'm just catching up. Not sure. How do you feel about that, Nigel, if I can answer that question?
Well, I personally think every experience has great value, even pain, even symptoms, even suffering.
Right.
Um, so I'll just speak personally again, and then from observation of others, is personally is every ailment that I've had led me to a greater understanding.
Mm,
And even though in the moment it's very difficult to see it and feel it, as I've gotten older, even when I'm in those moments, I find it easier to be grateful for the moment, even when it's
mm,
painful or
mhm.
symptomatic.
Wow.
But there's I think Marianne Williamson said this years ago is there's two ways to grow through pleasure or through pain.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, most of us it's through pain.
Right.
So pain has great value if you use it as a reflection.
Right.
Um, and so I think that's the general trend. So any patient and obviously not everyone has the ears to hear this,
Yeah.
especially when they're suffering or a loved one suffering, but is happening physically for a reason.
Mm,
I think just asking that question is the first step. And I've counseled a lot of people through some serious things in their lifetime, and
mm,
how do you explain a child who's dying of cancer? What's the reason? And those things can be very painful and damaging, but there's a reason there, and I don't really know what it is. I don't have the answers for people, but there's value in that.
right.
Um,
Right.
yeah,
Yes, I love that too. And I love the idea that even if we don't have the answer for that question, why do people suffer? Some children suffer. There's still this space for how can I help, as you said, what can I, even if it is this compassionate presence, and how can I somehow be fully present in love, with life unconditionally. So somehow that can pass on to somebody who's going through suffering. That's really my take. I always instead of because I of course I'm very curious. So I keep asking questions, and I do find some answers in different traditions of spirituality and ancient traditions, but it always goes back to compassion, love, kindness. It's just interesting how simple it is. And the moment just being present to these sacred states of being. It's interesting to notice. So you mentioned Marianne Williamson. She's the author. I mean, she worked a lot with the Course in Miracles, and I really that's a book that I have two copies in my house because I couldn't help it. It's just
yep,
it's part of that journey too. I just explored everything.
sure.
Yeah, it made a lot of sense to me. So we're almost at the end of the conversation. I could go on and on and on with you, but I want to go back to your book. Before that, another question came to mind. I have to ask, what do you feel is the purpose of the human experience, the purpose of being here?
So I would say the personal, and this is what gives me meaning to my day,
Yeah.
is my day is to, or not my day, my purpose is to grow, get closer to God, and become a better version of the person I started with.
Mm,
But the bigger purpose is to become fully illumined, which means, in my understanding, is to fully rid myself and ourselves of our ego drive,
yeah.
to have 100% trust and faith in the universe, God, at all times,
Mm,
without our ego drive putting the proverbial finger in the gears.
mm,
Because in my observation, most of our human suffering comes from our ego self,
mm,
protect self, take from
mm,
others. Um,
mm.
so I think it takes a lot of purification over time to be able to surrender
Yeah.
and go in the flow of the universe, because the universe creates universes. We just create our little lives,
Mm,
but our ego makes us think our lives are the center of the universe. So the goal is to, in time, to slowly purify that and get closer and closer to our universe connection.
yes.
That's my understanding, my purpose, and everyone else's.
How beautiful and so true. Know it or not, yeah, yeah. The truth always catches up, right? In the end, we'll be able to know that as humans. I really feel that way. Yes, we'll come to that understanding. Wow. Gosh, I just love. to have these conversations. And I wonder, gosh, the questions that I have to ask again. Do you bring this presence of what you know spiritually to be true to your practice as a doctor? Is that something that's
I
there?
do, and then I'm transitioning more to an online platform base so that I can kind of touch more people without having to necessarily be present in a room.
Right.
So this is what I'm going to be transferring more into our online programs, our 30-day programs, etc.
Ah,
But the
well,
answer is yes on a one-on-one basis.
that's wonderful to know. Gosh, I love that because that it feels like we need to have more of these conversations too. This
Agreed.
type of conversations. So I want to mention the website. So the book is available at drnigelbrayer.com, but I'll have that clickable so it's easy. You don't have to try to get the spelling. And also, should I have the other website too, Nigel, the Living Tree Center for Healing.com? Both of them or just one?
I'd say just keep the one on there for
Okay.
simplicity, and then we will have coming up. We're going to be having a mini course coming up in April. That's free, and then we're going to be starting our 30-day course in May, and that'll incorporate a lot of what you and I talked about, but then going into depth into some of the hormonal based factors related to incontinence. But it's not so much just incontinence. That's kind of, I call that the $1 million problem, the one
Mm,
that really affects people's lives.
yeah.
But like we talked about, it goes deeper. So I just
Right.
didn't feel like I could get the whole breadth in the book.
Right.
But the 30-day program is going to allow us to cultivate a lot of other things, from nutrition to diet to hormones to how to manage stress and how to start cultivating a more mind-based practice, and even making the connections of how your mind is affecting your physiology.
Mm,
Yeah.
how wonderful. Yes. Gosh. Thank you so much for your contribution, not just well being and health, but to sacredness. I have to say that. You really, it's the message to me has been always that when I listen to people like you, and I'm in touch with so many amazing people, that we need to start thinking more about in terms of sacredness. How can, treating the body as a vessel for divine intelligence. And this is really something that's crucial if we want to be healthy. That's we have to in a way start there. So thank you for opening that door, for being one more voice, within all these voices out there trying saying the same thing basically. So thank you so much again for your presence in our reality and your contribution. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Are there any questions that I didn't ask you? Anything that you left unsaid, Nigel, for this conversation?
No, I think that's wonderful. And then one final note is,
Yeah.
and I'll go back to that quote earlier, is the body
Uh,
is the blossom of the mind. So
yeah.
as we start making these changes, and you mentioned this earlier, Valeria, as you've developed yourself spiritually, your body changed. And
Oh, yeah.
as you make small changes, the body has to change. It's not a matter of will it change or if it'll change. It
Right.
always changes.
It does.
It's just it's not in question.
Mm,
So I say that in encouragement to people is, a lot of people have some very serious health related issues,
yeah.
but the answers are the same: is you take little steps, and over time the momentum builds. But we have to undo the momentum that we've created from the past. So
Right.
because we've made a choice today doesn't mean we erased the past 30 years. The
Right.
momentum of the past has to be dissolved with
Yeah.
the momentum of new choices,
Mm.
which again, that's where patience comes in.
Yes, gosh. I love your wisdom. Thank you so much. And it's timeless to me. Again, listening to you feels like a song. It does feel like a song. It's interesting, like a poetry. It's funny. That's my devotion to sacredness, to divine intelligence. So thank you so much for being this beautiful representation of the divine in human form. Thank you so much.
My
And
pleasure.
we'll talk again. I'll have all the one link here on the podcast notes, and we'll be in touch again. Bye for now.